In the grand suburbs of Boston, tucked within the walls of an opulent mansion that gleamed under the soft glow of the afternoon sun, Zoe found herself in a role she never imagined. At just 28 years old, life had swept her into the bustling world of high society, caring for the young daughters of a millionaire, despite the humble origins from which she came. The mansion, a stunning blend of modern luxury and classic charm, seemed to carry the weight of expectations upon its polished marble floors, yet Zoe had grown fond of its quiet spaces and ornate beauty. More than that, she had come to cherish her bond with Hazel and Harper, the two girls who had woven themselves into the fabric of her life. Zoe sat by their beds, brushing her fingers through her own wavy brown hair as the twins settled down for the night. Hazel, her soft blonde curls spilling over the pillow, looked up at her with wide blue eyes, the innocence of childhood reflected in every glance. Harper, her twin, nestled under the plush blankets, sighed contentedly. Yet for Zoe, the weight of the evening felt unusually heavy. She glanced at the clock, its hands nearing the late hours. "Miss Zoe, can you tell us one more story?" Harper's voice was a melodic whisper, her eyes still sparkling with the hope that lingered in childhood. Zoe smiled, the warmth in her heart pushing aside the fatigue. "Sweetheart, it's already late," she replied gently, adjusting the blankets around them. "Your parents will be upset if they find you still awake." A wave of quiet descended upon the room, broken only by the soft rustling of the silk curtains Zoe had drawn earlier, framing the moonlit garden beyond. The house, usually so full of life and activity, felt strangely still. Zoe couldn't shake the odd sensation that something was not quite right. There was an eerie stillness in the air that seemed to press against her chest, and she felt a chill creep down her spine. She turned, momentarily distracted by the unsettling quiet. "Did you hear that sound?" she asked, trying to mask the unease in her voice as she moved closer to the window. Hazel, already half asleep, blinked sluggishly and replied with a sleepy yawn, "Just Mr. Whiskers meowing on the roof again. Daddy says we might need to call the firemen to get him down one of these days." Zoe chuckled softly, trying to ease the tension in her chest. The children's innocent perception of the world was a comforting balm to her own racing thoughts. She turned to walk toward the door, ready to settle them in for the night. But then it came again. A soft creak from the hallway, as if someone were carefully moving over the old wooden floors. Her pulse quickened, and she froze. "Do you hear that?" Harper asked, her voice sharp now, her gaze wide with growing concern. Zoe's heart raced. "It's probably just the wind, dear. Go back to sleep." She gave a shaky smile, hoping to reassure the little girl, but deep inside, she knew the sound was far from ordinary. The Collins were supposed to be gone for hours. This shouldn't be happening. Her instincts screamed at her to check on the source of the sound, but she hesitated. She couldn't leave the girls alone, not when she felt something lurking in the shadows. Still, the voice in her head was insistent. She needed to investigate. "Stay here, Harper. I'll be right back," Zoe whispered, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Harper clutched her blanket, nodding silently, though her eyes mirrored the fear that had begun to surface. Zoe took one last look at the twins, their faces lit by the soft glow of the nightlight, before she turned the doorknob and stepped into the dark hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the silence so complete that Zoe's every step on the Persian rug seemed to echo in her ears. She strained to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing except the occasional creak of the mansion's aging bones. The faint moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Her breath quickened as she approached the source of the noise, a large linen closet at the far end of the hallway. As she neared the door, she hesitated, her heart pounding. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with anticipation, and an uneasy feeling settled over her like a heavy cloak. "Hello," she called softly, her voice barely audible above the hushed tension that hung in the air. There was no reply, only the soft rustling of fabric. Zoe's fingers trembled as they reached for the ornate door handle. She could feel the vibrations of her heartbeat in her fingertips as she twisted the knob, the click of the lock echoing in the stillness. The door swung open with a low creak, and Zoe's breath caught in her throat at what she saw. Inside the closet, huddled on the floor in a tangle of ropes and tape, were Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Their wide, terrified eyes met hers, pleading for help. The ropes were thick, binding them tightly, their mouths gagged with strips of tape. "Oh my God! Mr. and Mrs. Collins, what happened? Who did this to you?" Zoe exclaimed, dropping to her knees beside them. Her hands shook as she worked to untie the ropes, but Mr. Collins' frantic gestures stopped her. He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear, warning her not to untie them. Zoe was about to ask again when a cold shiver ran down her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something wasn't right. A sound faint but unmistakable began to drift toward her from the dark hallway. Zoe froze, her pulse racing as her instincts screamed for her to run. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the hallway. It was then that she saw it, a shadow, tall and menacing, moving silently toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure took shape. It was a man, his face obscured by a black mask, but those eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a chill straight to her bones. Zoe's legs felt weak, her heartbeat pounding in her chest as the figure stepped closer. She had no choice now. She was trapped. Survival instinct surged through Zoe, driving her to act with an urgency that left no room for second thoughts. The world around her seemed to blur as her feet moved swiftly toward the stairs. The hallway, eerily quiet moments ago, was now filled with the rhythm of her frantic footsteps echoing off the walls. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she screamed into the empty air, "Help! Help! Please call the police." Panic laced her voice, but she knew the enormity of the property, the vast distance between the houses, meant her cries were likely unheard. Still, she couldn't stop. She had to try. Behind her, the intruder's heavy footfalls grew louder, the thudding sound unnervingly close. Despite the bulk of his presence, the man moved with an unexpected speed, his pursuit relentless. Zoe's heart pounded, each beat a reminder that time was slipping away. She was desperate to escape. Reaching the top of the stairs, she cast a quick glance over her shoulder. The masked figure was close, his hand was nearly on her shoulder. Without thinking, she leaped forward, skipping several steps in her bid to gain distance, her body moving faster than it ever had before. "You can't escape," the intruder's voice rang out, low and gravelly. "There's nowhere to run." His words chilled her to the bone, but Zoe couldn't afford to listen. Adrenaline surged through her body as she descended the stairs, each step a frantic sprint toward safety. Her feet barely touched the ground, the thud of her shoes was swallowed by the relentless pounding of her heart. She could hear his pursuit behind her, feel his presence as if it was a shadow, stretching and closing in on her. She couldn't stop, not now. "Think, Zoe, think." She urged herself, her mind racing for a solution. A single misstep could be the end. She had to stay focused. She had to think of the twins, alone in their room, vulnerable, helpless. They needed her. But then, the worst happened. As Zoe's foot landed on the next step, it slipped. For a split second, the world seemed to stop, her body losing control as gravity claimed her. Her hands flailed, desperately searching for something to steady her, but the railing was just out of reach. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the rush of air and her fall. The steps blurred beneath her, the impact sharp and brutal as she tumbled down. Each thud of her body against the wooden stairs felt like a hammer strike, sending bursts of pain through her limbs, her ribs. No, the girls, she had to protect them. She finally came to a stop at the bottom, her body a tangled mess of limbs. Pain exploded in every part of her, dull, throbbing, overwhelming. Her head spun, and she struggled to stay conscious. Through the haze, she saw the figure slowly descending the stairs toward her. His footsteps were deliberate, the sound resonating in her aching skull. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Someone, help." Her eyes fluttered, fighting to stay open as the darkness began to swallow her whole. The shadow of the intruder grew larger, towering over her. Zoe's final thoughts were not of her own survival, but of the girls. God protect them. With that, her consciousness slipped away, leaving only darkness in its wake. When Zoe awoke, time seemed to stretch infinitely, her senses disoriented as if waking from a long, cruel dream. The first thing she registered was the cold and icy chill that settled deep in her bones. Her vision was blurry, and her mind foggy, as though waking from a deep, unsettling sleep. Slowly, painfully, her eyes adjusted, revealing the dim, oppressive darkness of what appeared to be a basement. Panic surged in her chest as the memories flooded back sharp, fragmented flashes of the terror she had experienced. She attempted to move, but a sharp, biting pain held her still. Her arms and legs were bound tightly to a wooden chair. The restraints dug into her skin, the ropes thick and unforgiving. She tried to shift, but every attempt was met with searing pain. Zoe groaned, struggling to regain some semblance of control, her heart pounding as the reality of her situation began to settle in. The basement smelled of mold and dampness, the musty scent clinging to the air. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The vague outlines of old furniture and stacked boxes came into view, casting eerie shadows against the dim light that filtered through from above. The girls. Where were they? What had happened to them while she was unconscious? Zoe's breath hitched, the weight of her responsibility sinking in. She tested the ropes again, but they held firm. She gritted her teeth, determined not to give in to fear. She scanned the room, her eyes searching for anything that could help her escape. A rusty old saw hung on the opposite wall. It was close enough to see but far enough away to seem impossible to reach. Zoe's mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Then, a sharp creak echoed through the house above her. Zoe froze, her breath caught in her throat. Someone was moving on the floor above, close, too close. She could hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing nearer to the basement door. Stay calm, Zoe. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, as fear gripped her chest. She needed to think. She couldn't afford to panic. Every sound, every movement could be a clue. The footsteps stopped. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. The sound of a key turning in the lock made her blood run cold. She locked eyes on the basement door, waiting for it to open, for the intruder to return. Her heart raced in her chest, each beat deafening in her ears. Please let this not be the end. She had to stay strong for the twins. The door handle began to turn. Zoe's body tensed, her muscles locked in place, her breath shallow. She couldn't let him intimidate her. Not now. She gathered every ounce of courage she had left. She would fight. She would do whatever it took to keep the girls safe. The door creaked open slowly, a sliver of light creeping down the basement stairs. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as the silhouette of a figure appeared against the light. She didn't wait. Who is there? What do you want? Zoe shouted, her voice shaking but resolute. She would not show weakness. Upstairs, the twins were awake. The muffled scream had pulled them from their sleep, leaving them wide-eyed and nervous in the dark room. Harper, the braver of the two, was the first to get out of bed. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet as she quietly reached for Hazel's hand. "Did you hear that?" It sounded like Miss Zoe. "We have to check on her," she whispered urgently. Hazel hesitated but nodded, allowing her sister to pull her from the safety of their bed. The two girls, clad in matching unicorn pajamas, crept quietly down the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached the top of the stairs, pausing to listen. A faint sound came from below. "It's Miss Zoe. She needs us," Harper whispered, tugging her sister toward the stairs. Hazel hesitated, fear in her eyes. "What if it's a monster?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harper shook her head. "Monsters aren't real. We need to help Miss Zoe together." They crept down the stairs, unaware of the danger that still loomed just beyond their reach. As the night stretched on, Harper and Hazel remained frozen in their hiding spot, hearts hammering in their chests like a relentless drum. The treehouse around them, usually a haven of safety and fun, now felt like a dark and suffocating prison. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of aged wood, mingling with the faint scent of freshly cut grass that lingered from the yard below. They held their breath, straining to hear any sign of movement, any sound that would signal the intruder's return. It had been so quiet for so long that it was almost unbearable. The sound of the neighbor's dog barking still echoed in their ears, but it had grown distant, its energy fading as it likely wandered off in pursuit of some other distraction. The girls, however, remained as still as possible, the warmth of their fear pooling in their stomachs. Every creak of the treehouse felt like a signal, a warning that the man might be coming back. The distant clatter of his footsteps on the grass was still vivid in their minds. They could not shake the image of him tall, cloaked in darkness, his face hidden behind a mask. His voice had been deep and cruel, his words a promise of something terrible. "Where are you, you little pests? Come out, wherever you are." Harper squeezed her sister's hand tighter, her fingers trembling. She wanted to believe that the man had gone, that he had given up and left the yard, but doubt gnawed at her. What if he was still out there, watching, waiting for them to make a mistake? "Harper," Hazel whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their breathing. "What if he comes back? What if he finds us?" Harper didn't answer at first. She didn't know what to say. What could she say to calm her sister when she herself was terrified? Instead, she leaned closer to Hazel, pulling her into a tight embrace, feeling the warmth of her little body pressed against hers. They sat in silence, each girl lost in her own thoughts, but never straying far from the reality that was hanging over them like a storm cloud. They had to think of a way to escape before the man came back. Harper's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the treehouse forever. They needed to get to Mrs. Patel's house, the kind neighbor who had always been there for them, offering sweets and warm smiles. If anyone could help them, it was Mrs. Patel. But the question was, how could they get there without being caught? The yard between them and the neighbor's house felt like miles, and there was no telling if the intruder was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I think we need to move," Harper said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. "We have to get to Mrs. Patel's house. She'll help us." Hazel nodded, her eyes wide with fear. But she didn't argue. They both knew that staying in the treehouse any longer wasn't an option. Harper glanced over at the small wooden chest where they had hidden just moments before. It was still there, tucked against the far corner of the platform. They had no idea how long they could stay there undetected, but it wasn't safe. They had to move. "Do you remember the way?" Harper asked. "To Mrs. Patel's." Hazel's eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination as she nodded again. "I do, but how will we get past him?" Harper's mind raced. The man had been close before, but now they had a chance. She had to believe they could do this. They had to be quiet, like little shadows slipping through the night. "Let's wait a few minutes," Harper said, her eyes scanning the darkness of the yard below. She had seen the intruder near the tool shed earlier, and she could still picture his hulking silhouette in the dim moonlight. "When it's quiet, we'll make our move." Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. The girls sat together in the cramped treehouse, their small bodies pressed close for comfort and warmth. Each moment stretched on longer than the last, and every sound from the yard seemed amplified, each footstep or rustle of leaves making their hearts race all over again. Hazel shifted restlessly beside her, but Harper didn't dare move, not yet. They had to wait for the right moment. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed from the yard below, followed by a soft creaking sound, the unmistakable noise of the treehouse ladder being moved. Both girls froze, their breath caught in their throats. The intruder was back, climbing up. Harper held her sister's hand in a vice grip, her own heart thudding so loudly she was sure the man could hear it. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt impossible. Her gaze flicked to the small window that faced out into the yard. She could see his silhouette now, much closer than before, creeping slowly toward the treehouse. His movements were deliberate, as if he was savoring the hunt. "He's coming up," Hazel whispered, terror creeping into her voice. Harper glanced around the treehouse in a panic. The toy chest, their only hope of staying hidden, was still open. Without thinking, she pulled Hazel inside it, both of them squeezing into the small space, just as the sound of footsteps reached the platform above. They could hear the man's heavy breath now, each exhale a reminder that they were dangerously close to being caught. Harper quickly closed the lid, praying that the intruder wouldn't notice them. Inside the chest, the world felt suffocatingly small. The smell of old wood and dust filled their noses, and the sound of their breathing was like thunder in their ears. They held their breath, desperate to remain still, their hearts pounding in unison. For what felt like an eternity, the world outside was silent. Then, just as Harper thought she might suffocate from the tension, the footsteps faded away. The intruder had moved on. They had been lucky, but how much longer could they stay hidden? Minutes passed before Harper finally dared to open the chest again. She held her breath as she peeked out, eyes scanning the dark yard below. The figure of the intruder was nowhere in sight, but she knew he hadn't given up. He would be back. They had to move, and fast. Hazel's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of hope in them now. What do we do next? Harper reached out, pulling her sister to her feet. We move now, quietly. Together, they crept out of the treehouse, hearts racing with every step. They had to reach Mrs. Patel's house. They couldn't stay in the yard any longer. The full moon above cast an eerie glow over everything, but the girls were no longer afraid of the dark. They were afraid of what waited in it. Stay close, Harper whispered, and don't look back. The moonlight streamed through the gaps in the wooden blinds, casting long shadows across the quiet house. The stillness was suffocating, each creak of the floorboards sending a chill through Zoe's already tense body. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she crouched in the corner of the darkened office, clutching the phone tightly, praying it wouldn't give her away. It had been a long, agonizing silence since she'd dialed the emergency number, and every moment felt like an eternity. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please pick up. But before she could lose hope, a voice finally broke through the static. Police, what is your emergency? The calm operator's voice felt like a lifeline. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to speak, keeping her voice low and steady. There's an intruder in the house, she said quickly. He's tied up the owners, and he's looking for the children. I'm at the Collins residence on Maple Street. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside the office. Zoe froze. Her blood ran cold as the heavy thud of footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. She ducked behind the desk, clutching the receiver tightly, praying she wouldn't be heard. The operator's voice came through again, but it was distant now. Ma, are you still there? What's the full address? Zoe opened her mouth to speak, but before she could finish, the phone went dead. A high-pitched tone echoed in her ear, and she pressed the receiver harder against her ear, hoping it was a mistake. But no, she heard nothing now except the pounding of her heart. Panic surged through her as the realization hit the intruder had cut the phone lines. Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to steady her breathing. The house had been isolated. No one would know where they were or what was happening to them unless she found another way to get out. The children, the twins Hazel and Harper, they were still in danger. And Zoe had to get to them, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, across the house, the intruder had shoved Mr. and Mrs. Collins down the hallway, their hands tightly bound behind their backs. The masked figure's grip on their arms was unyielding, his movements quick and sharp, almost too deliberate. His eyes gleamed through the slits of the mask, a mixture of satisfaction and cold rage. They were nothing more than pawns to him, tools to unlock the secrets he was desperate to uncover. Where are they? He hissed, shoving them toward the built-in cabinets in the hallway. The children, where are they hiding? And the code, tell me the code to the safe. Mrs. Collins trembled, her breath quickening. Please, don't hurt them, she sobbed. We have 2 young girls. Please don't. Enough, the intruder barked, his patience thinning. He leaned in, his voice low and threatening. The code, now. Mr. Collins stood firm, despite the terror in his eyes. We don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice steady but tight. There's no safe. The intruder's lips curled into a twisted smile. You think I don't know about the safe behind the painting? He turned, jerking the heavy portrait from the wall with one violent pull. The hidden safe was revealed, nestled into the wall like a dark secret. His fingers danced over the cold metal, a smirk creeping across his face. Bingo, he muttered to himself, his fingers brushing against the dial of the safe. Now let's see if you're telling the truth. Back in the office, Zoe's mind raced as she considered her options. She had to get to the twins. She had to get to them before it was too late. But the house was large, and each room seemed to hide more dangers than the last. She couldn't risk getting caught. Not now. As she stood up, careful to make no sound, her eyes flicked to the attic stairs. The creaky wooden steps loomed above her, the only path left to the children. She knew they had to be up there. Hazel and Harper always used the attic as their hideout when they were scared. If they were anywhere, it was there. She moved cautiously, her body aching from the earlier struggle, her mind fixed solely on the task ahead. With each step, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the fear of discovery growing heavier. But she couldn't stop now. She wouldn't stop. Outside the door, she could hear the intruder's footsteps, faint but growing louder. She quickly ducked into the shadows, holding her breath as the figure passed by. Her pulse raced as she moved toward the attic door, praying she wouldn't be caught. Upstairs, the twins were huddled together in the corner of the attic, hidden behind old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. Harper's wide eyes searched the room anxiously, her small hands trembling as she held onto Hazel's arm. "Do you think he's gone?" Harper whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Hazel replied softly, peeking out from behind the stack of boxes. "But we have to stay quiet. We can't let him find us." They had been hiding in the attic for what felt like hours, ever since they had heard the strange noises downstairs and the frightening shadow of the masked man entering the house. They knew they had to stay hidden. They knew they couldn't risk being found. But then, Zoe's voice echoed softly through the attic.
"Hazel." Harper, the whisper was barely audible, but it carried with it the warmth and reassurance the girls desperately needed to hear.
The twins froze. They exchanged a look of disbelief before creeping toward the source of the voice. "Zoe," Hazel whispered, her voice filled with both hope and fear. "Is that you?" Zoe smiled, her heart lifting as she saw the girls come out of the shadows. She held out her hand, her voice a whisper of reassurance. "It's me. I'm here. You're going to be okay." But they weren't out of danger yet. They had to escape now. "Come on, we need to go," Zoe said, her voice urgent but gentle. "We don't have much time." The twins nodded, their fear giving way to a surge of hope. Together, they crept down the attic stairs, careful to avoid making a sound. Outside the door, they could hear the intruder's footsteps growing closer. The house was a maze, and every turn felt like it could be their last. But Zoe wouldn't let them down. Not now. Not ever. They were going to make it out, and they were going to do it together. As the moonlight filtered through the attic window, casting long, ghostly shadows across the room, Zoe knelt down in front of the twins. Her heart pounded with a mix of relief and fear, her eyes locking onto the two small, frightened faces that stared back at her. The girls were huddled together in the far corner of the attic, trembling, their eyes wide with panic. Harper, ever the brave one, was the first to speak, her voice quivering with a fear that only heightened the urgency of the moment. "We thought the bad man had hurt you," she whispered, her words punctuated by the sharp tremor in her voice. "We were so scared. We ran out of the treehouse and hid here." Zoe felt a rush of protective love for the twins. She drew them into her arms, holding them tightly against her chest, feeling their tiny bodies shake with the residual fear that clung to them like a second skin. The attic was suffocatingly silent, save for the distant creak of the old house settling. She knew they didn't have much time. "Are you both okay?" Zoe asked, her voice trembling with concern as she checked their small arms and legs for any sign of injury. Their faces were pale, their eyes red from crying, but they were unscathed. For a moment Zoe allowed herself to breathe a little easier, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down for long. "We need to leave," Zoe said, her voice steadying, though her heart raced. "Listen carefully, girls. I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to be brave and very quiet. Can you do that?" Hazel, eyes wide and filled with tears, nodded solemnly. Zoe could see the fear in their eyes, but there was also trust that Zoe would get them out of this nightmare. "But the bad man is downstairs," Hazel whispered, her voice breaking. Zoe glanced around the attic, her mind racing for a way out. The danger was so close now she could almost feel it closing in on them like a tightening noose. But then, her gaze landed on the small window near the roof, partially obscured by an old tarp. A plan began to form in her mind, risky as it was. It could be their only shot at escape. "Girls, we're going to use that window," Zoe said, her voice firm, though it trembled slightly with the weight of the decision. "We'll climb down onto the roof and jump to the nearest tree. You've done it before when you were playing, right?" The twins exchanged a hesitant glance, their fear mingling with a flicker of recognition. They had done this before, but never with stakes so high. Zoe took a deep breath, knowing the next moments were critical. She began moving boxes and old furniture, clearing a path to the window. Each box she shifted felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Every sound was magnified in the quiet attic. Every scrape of wood, every thud of a box, seemed like a deafening alarm in the stillness. Zoe wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to stay calm, trying to keep the fear from taking root in her own heart. Almost there, just a little more. She was stretching to reach the latch when they heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards from below. Someone was coming. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, heavy. Zoe froze, her blood running cold. The twins, sensing the danger, clung to her legs, their bodies trembling violently. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until Zoe could almost feel the intruder's presence creeping up the stairs behind her. Zoe's mind raced, the seconds stretching out in what felt like an eternity. She had no time to think, only to act. Without a word, she grabbed the twins by the hand and hurried them toward the window. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the tension of their impossible situation. With quick, practiced movements, Zoe unlocked the window and pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, offering a brief moment of relief. "Okay, girls," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. "We need to climb down onto the roof, and from there we'll jump to the tree. Can you do that for me?" Harper, always the first to act, nodded, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She was scared Zoe could see that, but she wasn't going to back down. Zoe helped her climb out first, then Hazel, guiding them carefully as they stepped onto the slanted roof.
The tiles were slick under their bare feet, the sharp scent of rain still lingering in the air. Every step felt precarious, every shift of weight on the roof a reminder of how dangerous this escape was. But they couldn't stop now. They had to move.
Zoe glanced nervously back at the attic stairs, her heart in her throat. The footsteps had stopped, but she knew the intruder wouldn't give up that easily. They had only moments before he would find them. "Just a little more," Zoe murmured, her voice strained with the effort of keeping her composure. They reached the edge of the roof, and Zoe took a moment to assess their next move. It was a long drop to the ground, but there was a sturdy tree branch just below them that could break their fall. "Hold on tight," Zoe instructed as she helped the twins lower themselves onto the branch. Their small hands gripped tightly as they made their way down. Zoe was the last to climb down, her heart pounding with every creak of the branch beneath her feet. Once they were safely on the ground, Zoe didn't pause. She grabbed the twins' hands and led them quickly toward the garage.
But the garage door was locked, the handle refusing to budge. Harper tugged at it in vain, her frustration building.
Zoe scanned the area, her mind working at lightning speed. Then her eyes landed on a small side window, just large enough for the girls to squeeze through. Without a second thought, she shattered the glass with her elbow, wincing at the sharp sting of pain as blood began to drip from her arm. "Get inside," Zoe urged as she helped the twins through the window and followed quickly behind them. They scrambled into the garage, their hearts racing, adrenaline pumping through their veins. "Quick, get in the car. We're getting out of here," Zoe said, her voice urgent. She sprinted toward the Collins family's sedan, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the keys. When she found them hidden under the sun visor, she slid them into the ignition with a sigh of relief. But as she turned the key, the engine sputtered. The car didn't start. Panic surged through her. She tried again, but the engine refused to cooperate. "No, no, no, please," she muttered, her frustration mounting. Stepping out of the car, Zoe rushed to check the tires. Her heart sank as she saw that all four had been slashed. The intruder had thought of everything. In that moment of despair, headlights suddenly pierced the darkness outside the garage. Zoe froze, her blood running cold. Was it him? Was the bad man here? "Who is it? Is it the bad man?" Harper whispered, her voice barely audible. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window and saw the unmistakable silhouette of a police car. The sirens were off, but the blue and red lights flashed silently, casting eerie glows across the night. A wave of relief washed over her, but Zoe knew the danger wasn't over yet. Two officers stepped out of the car, their hands resting on their weapons as they surveyed the scene. Zoe's pulse quickened as one of the officers called out, "Oh, police. Is anyone there? Help! Please, there's an intruder in the house," Zoe shouted, waving frantically to get their attention. The next moments unfolded in a blur of action. Zoe held the twins close as the officers rushed past her and toward the house. She felt a mix of fear and hope, her heart in her throat as she watched the officers pursue the intruder. The struggle was brief but fierce, but the officers were trained, and within moments the intruder was subdued, handcuffed, and brought to the front of the house. One of the officers approached Zoe, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right? Is anyone hurt?" he asked. Zoe shook her head, her voice trembling as tears of relief streamed down her face. "We're fine. Thank God. But the girls' parents, they're still inside." The officer nodded, his expression serious. Without wasting a moment, he turned and rushed into the house to check on the rest of the family. The night had felt endless, as though time itself had stretched to the breaking point. But at long last, Zoe saw the familiar flashing lights of the police vehicles drawing near, their arrival heralding the end of the nightmare. As the officers stepped out of their cars, they led a handcuffed figure toward the patrol vehicle. Zoe's heart sank when she recognized the man. It was Jack. The mask that had hidden his identity was now removed, and the face staring back at her was one that had once seemed familiar but now filled her with a deep sense of unease. Mr. Collins, his face pale and his expression a mix of disbelief and anger, stepped forward. "Jack? Is that really you?" His voice trembled, caught between surprise and sorrow. The man in the police car glared back, his eyes filled with venom. "You ruined my life when you fired me," Jack spat, his words dripping with hatred. "I was only trying to take what was mine." His tone was sharp, bitter, his resentment unmistakable.
Zoe stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with a tumultuous swirl of emotions. She was grateful that the danger had passed, proud of the way she had protected the twins, and deeply thankful for the timely intervention of the police. Yet, there was something unsettling about seeing Jack, a man she had once thought she knew, reduced to this.
As the family gathered around, the twins Harper and Hazel ran to their parents, collapsing into their arms with sobs of relief. "Mommy, Daddy," they cried in unison, their little hands clutching at their parents as if trying to anchor themselves to something solid. Mrs. Collins, still visibly shaken from the traumatic ordeal, turned to Zoe. Her eyes, red-rimmed and filled with unshed tears, reached out to Zoe as if searching for words to express her gratitude. Gently, she grasped Zoe's hands in her own, squeezing them with a tenderness that was both an expression of love and profound appreciation.
"Zoe," she began, her voice catching with emotion. "I don't even know how to begin. What you did for us tonight. There are no words that can truly express how grateful we are. You risked your own life to protect our daughters. You've shown us courage that goes far beyond the role of a nanny." Her voice wavered, but she continued, finding strength as she spoke. "When we hired you, we knew you were special, but I never could have imagined just how extraordinary you truly are. You're not just a nanny, Zoe, Mrs. Collins whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a guardian angel. A hero."
Harper, the more outspoken of the two, looked up at Zoe with shining eyes, her voice full of awe. "You're our superhero, Zoe," she declared.
Mrs. Collins smiled through her tears, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "And she's right," she added, her voice growing stronger. "You are a superhero. Not just for the girls, but for all of us." She paused, her gaze softening as she took in the image of her family, safe and whole. "Zoe, you're not just our nanny anymore. You're part of our family."
Zoe felt a lump form in her throat, overwhelmed by the sincerity of Mrs. Collins's words. She had never expected this kind of recognition, let alone the emotional outpouring that was unfolding before her. The adrenaline of the night was beginning to fade, leaving her physically drained, but the love and gratitude she felt from the Collins family gave her a deep sense of peace. "We want to give you more than just a raise," Mrs. Collins continued, her voice filled with determination. "We want to offer you a position with more responsibility within our family and our business. You've proven tonight that you can handle anything, and we want you to grow with us. We want you to be part of our future." Mr. Collins, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. He looked at Zoe with a mixture of respect and admiration. "Zoe," he began, his voice deep and sincere, what my wife just said only scratches the surface of how much we want to express our gratitude. Your courage, your quick thinking, your dedication to our daughters, these things go beyond anything we could have hoped for in a nanny." He glanced at his daughters, who were now smiling shyly at Zoe, and added, "You didn't just save our girls' lives, Zoe, you protected our family, and for that, we will never be able to repay you." His voice faltered for a moment, as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. "But we can offer you something," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with a deep sense of sincerity. "In addition to the promotion my wife mentioned, we want to offer you a stake in our business. We want you to be a part of not only our family, but also our future. We believe in your character, your bravery, and your intelligence, and we know you have so much more to offer."
Zoe stood speechless, unable to process the magnitude of what they were offering. She looked from Mr. Collins to Mrs. Collins, her mind racing. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice a whisper of disbelief.
"You don't need to say anything right now," Mr. Collins said gently, offering her a reassuring smile. "We understand that this has been a traumatic night for all of us, but we just want you to know how much we value you. You're not just an employee to us, Zoe, you're family." As if to emphasize his words, the twins suddenly rushed over, their small arms wrapping around Zoe in a tight hug. Harper and Hazel, still reeling from the events of the evening, clung to her as though she were their anchor in a storm. "Please say you'll stay with us forever," Zoe Hazel pleaded, her voice muffled against Zoe's shirt. Tears welled up in Zoe's eyes as she hugged the girls back, feeling a profound sense of love and gratitude. Looking up at Mr. and Mrs. Collins, she finally managed to speak, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me, for giving me this opportunity. I love these girls like they're my own sisters, and I'm honored to be part of your family." The family embraced, pulling Zoe into their circle. In that moment, under the flickering lights of the police cars and the serene starry sky, a new family bond was forged, one that would be unbreakable, built on love, trust, and the trials they had faced together. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and the atmosphere at the Collins residence had transformed. The once eerily quiet garden now echoed with the joyous laughter of Hazel and Harper, who played carefree in the lush green grass. The home, once a place of fear, had been transformed into a sanctuary of love and security. Zoe, now no longer just a nanny but a cherished member of the family, watched the girls from the porch, a serene smile gracing her face. Her promotion had come with a generous raise, but more importantly, it had granted her something far more precious, a deep sense of belonging. The physical scars on her wrists from that harrowing night had faded, much like the nightmares that had once plagued her. Mrs. Collins and Mr. Collins emerged from the house, carrying a tray of freshly made lemonade, their faces reflecting a newfound peace. The trauma of the invasion had brought them closer than ever before, prompting them to prioritize family time and cherish the moments they had together. "Zoe, dear, come join us," Mrs. Collins called out, her radiant smile a reflection of the peace she had finally found. The twins ran toward the porch, their faces flushed with excitement. Harper, as always, began eagerly recounting her latest adventures in the garden, while Hazel, still a little shy, snuggled into Zoe's lap. It was a picture-perfect moment, one that Zoe had never imagined she would experience. The air was full of the promise of a bright future, a future built on love, trust, and the strength they had found in each other. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Zoe knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she belonged, home with her family. And as she tucked the girls into bed that night, there was no hesitation, no fear. Only peace, gratitude, and the deep knowing that she was right where she was meant to be.